And welcome back to another episode of the Real Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Jacob O'Connor. Real Conversations is a podcast for those dedicated to doing hard things and living a meaningful life. Today, back on after, I should have looked up. I think it's been probably 18 months.
It's been a while.
Dane, Laughlin, how you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. You've had some big life changes recently.
Well, and same to you.
It's been a really pivotal time in both of our lives, I would say.
It's been crazy. Yeah, it's interesting too. I feel like it goes in waves. You know, like there'll be times of kind of stagnation or stasis, and then all of a sudden it's like everything changes all at once. And yeah, it's crazy.
I feel like that's what makes it fun and exciting though. Like sitting in one place and I don't know, like living that kind of normal straight line is not fun to me. Like I like the peaks and I also like the valleys in kind of a weird way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think there's something to be learned in the stasis parts too. I think it's where you can start to lose context as like what's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's like, you know, the waves and the troughs are where you learn a lot of new things. And I think in the stasis, it's like where you get the opportunity to really appreciate what you have.
Yeah. Do you think, okay, so if we assume everyone's life is in fact operating on a wave of peaks and troughs, highs and lows, do you think that it's just kind of like sound waves where they're of different lengths? And so some people that are in a stasis for longer are still either heading up or heading down. They're never actually in that same place. It's just a longer waveform.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think you don't want to have just a lot of ups and downs because that's just turbulence.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, how do you make the peaks higher and the troughs not as low? Right.
Yeah.
So that you're continuously moving up and forward. And I think that kind of, if you look at like, you know, a wave, you know, on a chart and you like drew a straight line, that's, you know, your average. And that's how you can kind of tell, like, am I making progress or not? I think the hard part is like when you're in it, it's hard to really know, like, you know, in some cases, like in the situations where you're in a clear, you know, trough or you're in a clear peak, it's probably pretty obvious. But I think the differentiation between like what's, you know, average and what's like making the move forward is not maybe as obvious.
Yeah. Do you think that people operate at different frequencies? Like someone that is operating at a high frequency has highs and lows really quickly, like whether that's professionally or whatever they're doing in their lives, and that helps to accelerate their growth? Or like, how do you conceptualize that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to like, again, like, you know, you want your highs to be higher than the lows, because if you're oscillating up, then it means that you're making progress. You can also oscillate down, right? Which is not a good thing. And so I think it probably depends on like that trajectory overall. But I think the goal for everybody is like, everybody's going to have highs and lows. The trajectory should be up. And so how do you actually create metrics for yourself? You know, like you said, like look back 18 months at our lives, significantly different than they are today. But I would probably argue for both of us that our lives are better than they were 18 months ago.
Yeah.
And so I think having a look back period where you kind of use the metric of like, am I moving up, is a good metric for definition. I guess maybe my short answer is I think it takes time to understand if you're on the right trajectory.
Right.
But everybody has highs and lows, you know, in between.
I think that evaluation period of your trajectory is super, super critical. Like you're making the comment of make sure you look back and make sure that your trajectory is aiming upwards. And I think if you double tap on that, that is built of a micro set of goals and kind of different metrics that you are evaluating that on. Like what metrics do you use to evaluate your life and if it's heading in the direction you want it to be?
It's a good question. You know, it's interesting too, because I think they change over time, which is maybe a tough thing because it's a moving target. You know, I think one aspect is like optimize on happiness. You know, are you happier again now than I was 18 months ago? And there's a lot of things to unpack on like what makes you happy. You know, there's family, there's your job, there's overall, you know, physical health. There's all kinds of things that roll up into that. But I think like if there's, it's good to do a wellness check, you know, and you know, I don't think it needs to be 18 months, but like looking back and like, am I better today than I was yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, like where did I go wrong? How do I, you know, fix that?
So this is kind of nerdy of me, but I'm curious, like, have you ever done a practice of assigning values to that, whether that's a grade on that axis or whether that is a percentage or like some sort of actual scoreboard for those areas that matter in your life.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this is why like money has been something that people get so perplexed by, because it's a proxy, I think, that they use to try and determine happiness, which is like, oh, if I make X amount of money or I make more money, then of course I'll be happier. I think that the fundamental problem with kind of the happiness, metric is that like, it's not as obvious what makes people happy.
Right.
Right. And from day to day, that'll oscillate pretty dramatically.
Mhm.
Like somebody honks at you in your car and like you're all of a sudden you're upset. And you could be listening to your favorite song, the second before. So I think happiness is a hard metric to define.
Mhm.
But I do think like, financial well-being, personal well-being from like a health perspective, I think relationship well-being.
Mhm.
And if you can set metrics in those kind of three areas, and I think it's at least a good thing to measure in order to understand if you're making good progress or not.
This is not a fully fleshed out thought, but I have been having recent thoughts of, I feel like happiness is somewhat of a vanity metric, because I feel like happiness insinuates that life is easy and that everything is great. And I think that like that's never really the case. I've really been kind of pro lately on like meaningful, because like when something is meaningful to me, like I'm willing to do the difficult thing that is required for the outcome that I would like to achieve, but it's not fully dependent upon it just solely being all rainbows and sunshine. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of what I've been toying around with.
Well, so I think the way I would define happiness for myself is that things are meaningful. So maybe it's a conflation of things,
That's fair.
For me in my life. I also think like I can be happy eating, Twinkies, and it's not, it's not what I should be doing. And so, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think it's like fulfillment in the things that I'm doing, and then happiness is an outcome, but maybe fulfillment's like the macro, right? That you're shooting for is like, I want to be fulfilled. And also I want to make sure that I'm fulfilling what I feel like I should be doing.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like, I don't think you get fulfillment by doing anything other than fulfilling your own obligations.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of an interesting cycle there.
Right. Hey guys, Jacob here. Real quick before we get back to the episode, I just want to take a quick second to say, if you guys are enjoying this episode, please make sure to share the link with a friend. You may have noticed I don't run any ads in the podcast. In fact, I don't make any money off the podcast. It's quite the contrary. Over the past 5 years, I've invested a lot of time, money, and effort into the growth of the show, trying to continually upgrade the equipment, bring on better guests, and just improve the overall quality of the podcast. So if you guys are enjoying this episode, or if you enjoyed previous episodes, please share the link with a friend. Sending it to 1 or 2 people makes a huge difference for me on the back end. As always, I appreciate your guys' support. Let's get back into the episode. When you say fulfilling your own obligations, that's interesting, because there's like a call to personal responsibility with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have some sort of obligation. And I almost, again, I don't know if I'll fully flesh this out, but like we were talking about the highs and the lows earlier, I almost feel like there's a proportionality to it, like order and chaos of like an equal high to an equal low, and both are required for that through line.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also think, I think that having responsibilities can actually pull you up in that trend line as well. So like, well, for you, having the restaurant, right? It's a great example. Like, you probably are pretty tired some days, don't want to wake up and go and do those, but you have a responsibility and you're fulfilled by doing that responsibility. And therefore it pulls you up, gets you literally out of bed, but also, I mean, figuratively, it pulls you forward into the future. So I think that there's something to committing to things and sticking to them that forces the kind of forward obligation and, forces that trend line, upward as opposed to downward. This
may be the hottest start, the first 3 minutes of the podcast that I've ever had. Like, dude, that was awesome.
Yeah. We'll see if it makes sense in post.
I don't know. I felt like that was just so quickly. Like, I don't know. Well, and Dane, to be fair, 18 months ago was your last episode. Remind the people who you are.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Dane Laughlin. Last time you heard from me, I worked for Coke Industries. I now work for a startup out of San Francisco, which I imagine we'll probably get into some of that here in a little bit. I enjoy working on classic cars and all things technology.
And you were, remind me of like the actual wording on it, but you rose through the ranks at Coke very quickly and did some very impressive things in that short period of time.
Yeah, we kind of started the spatial technologies team at Coke, which focuses on emerging tech like virtual and augmented reality. So it's really like a fascinating area that's still a passion of
Yeah.
mine. The AI space, digital twins, all that stuff. So like I said, when I say I'm a big fan of technology, I'm like a big time nerd when it comes to this stuff, and I really enjoy thinking about kind of what the future looks like with technology, which I think is it's a something that gives people both excitement and also makes them nervous given all the kind of accelerated progress we've seen
Yeah.
recently.
And also a huge shout out to Dane. I put him in this seat if you're watching the video because it's usually the best seat for the guest, and failed to realize that I've never recorded a podcast at 5:45 at the restaurant, and he is now battling the setting sun. And we've got we have these advertisements for our cold brew and then one of our mocktails on these cardboard cutouts, and we've stuck those in the window to the west over here. And we're trying to use them to block Dane out so he's not getting drowned by the sun. But
Yeah,
I'm
like
sorry, man.
No, you're good.
It looks like you're getting killed over there.
Oh, you're good. No problem.
Yeah. So going back to people's view of technology in the future, like how I feel like you got two senses of technology takes over and it's great, technology takes over and it's terrible. Like this technological nihilism is kind of brewing in some people's minds. Like, what is your view of the role of AI and technology in the future?
Yeah, man, that's a loaded question. I think it's fair, and I think it's also valuable to have a safe level of discomfort, with technology and AI. I mean, clearly we need to have regulation. We need to have ways to understand kind of where we're at, in the progression of the technology. But I also think that there's a level that you get to that's not productive, where it's like if you're laying awake at night wondering if AI is going to displace you, it's like it's probably not productive,
Right.
thought. And also, there the best way to help shape the future of the technology is to be a part of the technology, right? And so that's a big kind of key reason why I got into the areas that I got into, is that I want to be a part of helping the space develop and the implementation in businesses and things like that.
Again, I think that's that personal responsibility.
Yeah.
Like it's like rather than fear the thing, how do I take it on and be a part of it?
Yeah. And I also tend to think like it's pretty inevitable that technology will progress in this space. The genie's out of the bottle, if you will. And so, we can think about how we might stop it all we want, but the likelihood that that's actually going to happen is pretty low. And so I think instead it's more productive to think about what are the ways that we use this for good, and what are the ways that we, create rules in the system that prevent incorrect use of the technology.
In your day to day or like your week to week life, like how have you integrated technology in a way that has made you more efficient or has helped your life?
Man, so ChatGPT is an amazing thing. Like there's a pro version of ChatGPT that's like $20 a month. I really think that like everybody should have a pro license to ChatGPT just because of how efficient it allows me to be in certain aspects of my life. So like an example is, my wife and I took a trip to New York, like a year ago. This was like early in the technology.
Yeah.
And essentially I said, hey, we're going to New York for 3 to 5 days. These are the things that we want to see, organize essentially like group these things that we should do together, so that they actually make sense. And we're not going back and forth across the city. And it created a pretty good itinerary. Like it's, and that would have taken me several hours to do all the research, to do the implementation, or, to kind of note all of the things down, and then to synthesize that and make a proposal for my wife to be able to look at. And it was 10 minutes,
Yeah.
I think, if anybody does software engineering, there's a pretty clear use case there where it's like, I didn't go to school for software engineering, but now I can be a really effective software engineer because I have, ChatGPT there that can help me with those. Yeah. I mean, there's, and then also, like a thought partner is a really interesting use for a large language model.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is like, so you said this isn't a fully fleshed out idea. I'll literally say the exact same thing. I'm like, hey, ChatGPT, this isn't a fully fleshed out idea, but I'm kind of pulling on this string of like conceptually, how do I think about this thing? And the fact that it can just ask you questions that help you formalize your own thoughts is a really powerful, example.
It's like a soundboard.
Yeah, it's a soundboard, and it's also like, hey, like I'm going to say this, and then if you disagree or ask me questions that can further help me find clarity, or tell me, like, give me the opposing view, like give me a straw man, which is really an interesting concept too. So I have a lot of arguments with ChatGPT, is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
but it's really valuable for teasing out complex ideas.
Challenge my thinking. What a crazy prompt to give it. Yeah,
and it's pretty effective, at it too. And, in the end, you can kind of say, well, based on the conversation, like what logic path do you think actually wins out in that? Mm-hmm. And it'll give you an explanation and all these things. So it's a really fascinating tool. I will say there's a lot to watch out for, in this AI craze that we're all in right now too. So maybe we can get into that later, but it's a pretty amazing technology.
Is there any other technology that you use pretty frequently that's really helped?
Yeah. So like I said, the company that I work for uses augmented reality frequently. If I was in like a manufacturing facility or a mill, like I would be using it all the time, because the visual context of where I need to be and what I need to interact with, I think is incredibly important. I've been kind of getting into like health trackers recently. So like I've had a Garmin for years, but I like wearing watches. It's like this kind of a side hobby of mine. And so I've been looking a lot at like the Ultra Human rings and like the Aura rings and all the different wearable, health tracking technologies.
Are you familiar with Whoop?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
What do you think of Whoop?
I think Whoop's really cool. To be honest, I'm probably, for you, it actually, I think makes a lot of sense, but I'm probably not a good enough athlete to really benefit from having, the granularity that Whoop offers.
Yeah.
The thing that I like, with the ultra human stuff is that like I can wear a watch and still get all of the steps and heart rate and all the different, temperature.
And still have your style.
And so, and still be able to wear a cool watch. So, it's so funny though. Like this is a better watch than any, like watch that I could wear that's like mechanical or quartz. But there's something about that still that, I don't know, it sticks with me.
It's like the idea of a Rolex. Like I feel like the idea of wearing that watch, it's like my Garmin tells me about my sleep. My Rolex, you could probably put it in the water. I don't have a Rolex, by the way. But like you put it in water. That's about it. Tell you the time, it goes in water.
Yeah, exactly. Well, for me, it's interesting too, because like I've gotten into a niche thing where it's like, some of these watches, like people wouldn't even know unless they know. Yeah. So maybe that's what it is it's like a human need to like create a clan or something.
It's like your own little niche.
Yeah. So I actually like that better. Everybody can see a Rolex and sure, it's like a flex of wealth or whatever. But like, if you see like some niche sub brand of watch that nobody knows and somebody walks up and talks to you about it, you're like, okay, like I know, I kind of know you, like we can have an interaction and at least I know that you're passionate about this thing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting thing where it's like, for me, it's not even about like, oh, it's a Rolex. It's like creating a group or creating a tribe, if you will, of people that like the same thing.
Yeah. It signifies like an alignment in values or something. Like really interesting, different industry. First Form is a supplement company in St. Louis where I grew up. And you would think a supplement company wouldn't have like a strong culture, but like if you see people wearing the First Form t-shirt and you're from back home, or even people here recognize it, like you walk up and you say hi to them at the gym and it's like you immediately feel like you know the other person, because if they support that brand and you know what that brand stands for, then by the transitive property, you know that A also equals C.
Yeah. No, it's super fascinating. I mean, culturally, it's interesting how many things are like that too. It's, I mean, that's why people buy brand name anything. It's because you've bought into what that brand is, the quality of it, what it stands for, any of that stuff. And so, it's fascinating. Like the hype beast thing is really fascinating to me. Or even
hype beast.
Are you familiar with that? Okay. So hype beast is like, and so I'll be completely honest. I am not a part of the hype beast subculture. So I don't know if I misspeak, please don't come after me. Any of the hype beast.
They're going to be coming for you, man.
Yeah. But like Supreme and like some of those brands that, I think there's one called like Mischief too. It's interesting because they do a bunch of drops and like there's a bunch of people like stand in line for days, to pick up these products and things like that. So It's fascinating to me though that like a company can sell a t-shirt and it could be the same t-shirt that's on a rack at Dillard's or
Right.
wherever, but you can charge a multiple and people will wait outside for the equivalent of that because it says something about the community they're a part of. It's like
Yeah.
a fascinating part of human psychology that I don't quite understand.
Okay, I can't watch you stare at the sun. Give me a second. I think I've got an idea for this.
Sounds good.
Okay, so you just made a comment that this is the next version of Hot Ones where you have to stare into the sun and answer questions. And one of my friends I've had in the podcast a couple times, Todd Anderson, he started a podcast called Beat the Heat, where the sauna starts at 175 and he interviews you in it, and it gradually gets up to like 230 degrees.
Oh my gosh.
And so I think that you staring into the sun would probably be pretty similar to Beat the Heat.
I don't know about that. That seems way more intense than what was just going on. But yeah, I still think it's a good idea. You should just make this a recurring theme on the podcast. Just stare into the sun while Jacob asks you questions.
Or I could do like, if I'll ask personal questions like trivia about yourself. If you get it right, I'll give you sunglasses.
Oh, there you go.
And if you get it wrong, you got to take the glasses off.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
So I will have cut that part of what just happened. Dane was staring at the sun and he was starting to cry and I felt bad about him. And so I took the poster and I taped it to the window. So he should be good for now.
It's perfect. Now I think we're tracking too. Like we're going to be good for the rest of the episode.
Let's go, man. I'm hyped. Where were we in our conversation?
We were talking about technology and how generally people fear, or there is a fear of technology. The things that I use in my day-to-day life. So we were talking about like, I was looking at Ultrahuman as far as a wearable goes. I think it's interesting too, like the integration that these things are having into everyday life. Like I never used to think about like my sleep quality.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And now I'm like looking, like every morning I wake up and like first thing I'm like looking at my Garmin. I'm like, oh, like I did a terrible job, last night or whatever.
The crazy thing is like, so I never drank that much alcohol, but like it was always fun to go out and have a good time.
Yeah.
But now, honestly, the biggest hack for me not drinking much alcohol at all is like, I just know how it affects my sleep.
Yep.
And my Garmin will show me that. I can feel that. I know the research from Todd Anderson. Like I don't want to mess with my sleep.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Well, and alcohol kills sleep along with coffee and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I, it's funny when I was younger too, is like almost like a point of pride, like how little you slept and, you could go and function. It's like, now I'm like, dude, people are like, yeah, I got 2 hours of sleep. I'm like, you're an idiot, right? You're not gonna be able to function, so
talk about efficiency.
Yeah. Yeah.
The idea of a nightcap, like people are like, oh no, man, like I'm going to sleep so good tonight. And it's like, you don't understand. You fall asleep, but it's light sleep. You can't enter REM whenever your body's still digesting alcohol and breaking it down.
Yeah.
Like literally, I don't care how good you think you're sleeping during it. Over a prolonged period, it's not sustainable and it's not benefiting you.
I wonder, do you know if there's a threshold where like above a certain like body weight to like liquid ounces ratio? Like,
I don't know that, but I believe it is. If you're going to drink, you're better off drinking in the day so your body has more time to process it. I don't know what like the actual threshold is, but I think it's like, I'm not even going to try and do that. It's just better off early in the day.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah.
Which is why you should come to another broken egg for mimosas, Bloody Marys, and Irish coffees early in the
morning. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, by the way, I came and had the cold brew?
Yeah.
The alcoholic cold brew.
The spiked cold brew?
The spiked cold brew and the lavender. What's that? The lavender lemonade or whatever.
Oh, you had the lemon blueberry mimosa.
Lemon blueberry mimosa. Fantastic. Would 100% recommend.
Thanks for a little plug right there.
Yeah. Shameless plug.
Shameless
not for
plug.
Me.
Getting back to sleep though, is that something you actually monitor and like track with your Garmin?
Yeah, it's something I want to do more of. But like I said, I track with my Garmin. What's interesting is I feel like I have like a plateau that I can't get over. That's like at like 90, sleep score of 90 on my Garmin. I feel like I cannot surpass like 90 and I don't know what it is.
Are you consistently getting 90 or is it like an occasional 90?
No, I'll be like 85 to 90 consistently. Yeah. And I'm like, I guess that's good enough. Like I'm fine, but like I would love to see 100 and just feel great someday.
The type A in you is like, how do I get extra credit on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it feels like 100% would be awesome, but I don't know if I've ever had 100 sleep score.
I think I've seen it once. But I think it was after I was very sleep deprived. Like,
it was after you ran the 100-mile and your body's just like, I got to sleep now.
It was actually a couple weeks ago. So we opened the restaurant. John and I have not had a day off in 36 days now.
Wow.
And so we had a kind of a business meeting. Our general contractor who built the building took us to Kansas City for the Chiefs game. And so we did a full day of work, went to the Chiefs game, and then got back at 2 a.m. and had to open the restaurant at 6.
Oh, man.
And so that next night, I believe that's when I got my 100 because
Your
I
body's
was
just
so
quitting.
done. I was so done.
Yeah, that's funny. Wow. Yeah. No, I guess I'll have to figure out, maybe I'll write out what I've been doing and you can tell me where I'm going wrong.
Just try and tap yourself one night, like get like 2 hours one night. And then
yeah. No, well, and it's interesting too, because I can tell a difference like in a few points. I feel like, like if my average is 85 to 90 and then I go down to like 75, like I feel way worse.
Yeah.
Like it's not a linear thing. It's like 10 points makes a huge difference in cognitive ability.
Now, do you think that's almost self-fulfilling? You see the 75 and now in the back of your mind, you're subconsciously like, man, there's only 75.
We should run an experiment where I try and like say what my number is and then document that before looking at it and just see.
I like that. I think I'm going to do that.
Yeah. Because I think I could do a pretty good job of predicting it. I think I'd be really good at it. Like I said, if I'm like at an 85 to 90 on average and I get like 6 hours of sleep and like it's like a 70, like I'm going to know,
right?
That. I think like the difference between 70 and like 50 or 70 and 40 is less than the difference between like 85 and 75 to me.
Oh, you think the biggest difference between 85 and 75?
Yeah. I think there's like a definite like linear or a definite
correlation. No.
Well, it's like an outsized proportionate difference at the top end.
Yeah.
Whereas like if I get like, if I sleep for an hour and a half versus like 3 hours, I feel terrible.
Yeah.
Either way, like I'm going to feel terrible. But if I like the difference between 6 and 8 hours is significant for me.
That's interesting. I actually like the idea of theoretical versus actual on sleep scores. I think I'm going to start doing that.
Yeah. That's what they should do. Like there should be some feature for Apple Watches and all the other folks out there building these products. You should just ask people what they think their sleep score was before you give them their sleep score or make that a feature.
So sleep score would be categorized as health data. Are you the type of guy that believes in sharing anonymous health data with Apple and other companies to help them train algorithms make better product? Or do you have any fear with sharing all of that data?
I think I don't have any fear with anonymized data sharing. I think I have a fear of company telling me that it is anonymized and it's not actually anonymized. That's where I struggle more with it. But I think in general, like I don't really have an issue with generalized, anonymized data sharing, just because I think there's a lot of benefits that come out of that type of data. One example is, like the new Apple smartwatches will look for like arrhythmias. And so like you can actually save people's lives by having a big enough data set to be accurate in predicting arrhythmia. Is
that a regular heartbeat?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. Cardiac arrhythmia is a regular heartbeat. And so like, that's a pretty big deal. Like you could literally save people's lives. Now they're not going to save it just because like I decided to give them my data, as opposed to the other, hundreds of millions of people that are contributing to that. But I mean, that's an example where without anonymized mass data sets, like we wouldn't be able to get to a place where we can, save people.
Do you think, like, how often do you think it happens where a company tells you the data is anonymized, it's not actually?
I think if it's like a big legitimate, business, Apple, Samsung, the big names that like, if I told you the brand, like you'd be like, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think that you have to worry about them too much because of the legal complications of that. I think you get into like, instead of buying an ultra human ring, I bought like a Chinese smart ring to just see if I would like it. I'm pretty suspicious that thing is just sending all my data to the CCP.
They were also recording audio.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I think it depends on the source and all that stuff. I do think it's important though, like to understand that big data sets are required to have good AI. And so in order to have really good versions of Siri, which I think ChatGPT is like a great example of, or in order to have really good algorithms for cardiac arrhythmia or finding cancer, via different imaging, technologies. Like, you have to have those mass data sets. And so it's a catch-22 for folks who don't want to be involved in that, because it's like, the outcome is a really good thing for humanity. So I don't know. It's tough. It's a personal decision, I guess, for everybody.
Yeah, it definitely is. Going back to your comment of like good and bad, both sides of technology, what else are you worried about with technology in the future? Like something to keep an eye on?
Well, yeah, I mean, the AI stuff's kind of the immediate example, that a lot of people bring up. I think the outcome of that is actually interesting, where, like, for instance, if we're able to automate, a lot of the things that we do, the part of the intro to this podcast was talking about purpose. Like, what happens when we lose purpose through work, I think is a really tough question we just don't really know the answer to in a lot of ways. And so that's concerning to me, but it's also like exciting, because it's like, what if life was, Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Like, it's just a, perpetual vacation. Like, that's an interesting, is that a problem? Is it not? Can we adapt to that? Do people create their own problems in a vacuum?
I 100% think so.
Yeah. So, but I mean, like, I think you can create problems in a productive manner as well, where it's like, hey, you play a video game, right? And the problem is built into the game, and that's what makes it fun, is solving the problem. So yeah, I think there's like, that's probably the biggest existential risk to me, is just like, as we think through automating a lot of the tasks and stuff, like what is the human role, in a future where we have higher levels of intelligence. Let me caveat this by also saying, like, intelligence is an incredibly misunderstood thing, and I'm not claiming to understand it whatsoever. But I think when people think AI, artificial intelligence, people think of like a human, and I think it's actually not a very good proxy to think about a lot of the technologies as a human, because it's really using a completely different method to replicate a human, if that makes sense.
Yeah. They said, I can't remember who it was. Someone was building a robot, and in order, no. Maybe it was to understand the visual cortex better. They were trying to do it through robotics, and they weren't able to do it without building the full body because of the scope of that. Like, you can't, oh shoot, I'm trying to tie this back to what you just said. It was something about needing, intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
It's necessary to understand the full picture of intelligence, whether that's emotional, whether that's purely academical, mathematical, whatever it may be, rather than to just have one small section. You need the full picture.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Actually, a friend of mine from work just sent me this article, and it's escaping me. Maybe I'll send it to you, and you can link it or something. But it's a fascinating kind of essay that was written in like 2019. But it talks about like all of the original, like Google, like the Go, the chess, players, or actually Siri is a better example, right? There were teams of linguists to support Siri, like when it first came out, right? So it's people kind of putting the structures of what they think they know and how languages work and all that stuff. And Siri sucked, right? But the fascinating thing is, like, we got to a place where compute was cheap enough and, available enough that we just started shoving a bunch of different documents, a bunch of English, documents or whatever language documents into these LLMs. And it's able to much more effectively than Siri was, with all of these experts, recreate language. And so there's this fascinating dichotomy of like, you can try and build knowledge into systems as much as you'd like, or you can scale the compute. And scaling the compute, at least to date, has been a much more effective way, to get intelligence in a space than actually trying to teach it what we know, which is like a weird thing.
Was it Grant that sent you the article? Oh, because I could see how that's directly applicable with him.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's like an interest. I mean, this happens time and time again too. I mean, like the AI that originally was built for chess, essentially you got a bunch of chess masters, and you had to essentially try and download what those people knew into this bot.
Yeah.
And then there's a deep learning version of this where you just feed in, all the different potential options into a deep learning algorithm, and it's way more effective than people teaching it how to play chess.
Yeah.
And so it's like the what we actually think of it, there's another level of understanding of things than what humans have. We just live in a world that's contextualized to like what makes sense for us,
Right.
which is fascinating to think about. Is like, I don't know if you've ever seen that scale of like, it's like 0 to like chicken, and then you have human, and it's like what's beyond human.
Yeah.
Like it feels like there's a level of understanding of the universe that, I don't want to say the universe because it's too broad, but there's a level of understanding that surpasses what humans know right now, and we're trying to teach all these bots the things that we know.
Right.
And in reality, it's like, what can we learn, from that process?
Wow, that is incredibly deep.
It's weird. When I say weird, maybe that's what it is. It's like I don't have words for that.
Yeah.
Some of these things are like, as we're talking to, it's it's the sounding board, concepts. You're ChatGPT for me in these discussions.
I love it, and I think it's interesting that like you train large language models on a larger data set and then allow them to sift through it and figure it out themselves. I feel like I have a similar learning process to that, where like even with the restaurant, I knew nothing about restaurants, how to operate them, how the business worked, anything like that. And it was kind of like, I'll just figure it out. Like throw John and I to the wolves and just give us information overload. Personally, like it's overwhelming, but I almost prefer that because I like to sift through it, sort through it, and then build my own rules and then develop context and then operate that way.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think there's a significant misunderstanding of intelligence, I guess is the way that I would sum it up, is like, there's just so much we don't know, which is why it's so fascinating to me, but also why it's so scary to me and a lot of other people. Is it's like we don't know what this actually is, and like the fact that you can just throw a bunch of compute and data together and get some semblance of intelligence out of that is like is intelligence an emergent property of like just having compute and data together?
Like what actually fundamentally is intelligence?
Yeah, and I don't know that. It's a wild rabbit hole to run down, but I don't know that I have a good enough answer to that for myself.
If intelligence scales by offering more data and then the machine learning models build upon themselves, is consciousness on the table for AI and technology?
I think the first thing is like, what is consciousness? I
was about to ask you that.
So there's a fundamental question there, which I again, like, I don't know that anybody has a real answer to. What I do think is interesting is, so think about like, what are the constraints, in that equation, right? If it's like compute plus data equals intelligence.
Yeah.
What are we likely to run out of first is, I think, actually the thing that's interesting. I think right now, like we hear a lot about NVIDIA and other places, everybody's buying up GPUs and like, it's very expensive. Elon Musk has just built like the biggest supercomputer in the world, like in Memphis or wherever. I mean, right now the race is for compute, but I actually think in short order, the constraint's going to be like, we will have used all of the data available everywhere. And by the way, now you have an input where Gen AI is actually generating data that could or could not be right.
Yeah.
And
then does it train upon that data that could be incorrect?
And so the problem that you get into is then you lose the signal of what reality is, because now you just have mass generation of content. So I think there'll be some interesting like data structure problems that we run into, and like, how do you actually define? Actually, this is why like Google spent almost $1 billion on the Reddit, being able to train on Reddit.
I read about this.
Yeah, because Reddit is almost all humans.
It's a content generation engine.
Yeah, and so if you want to know how, now whether you could argue that Reddit's like also a terrible place if you're trying to understand like how humans interact, but I mean, it's a pretty pure signal as to like what the interactions look like and how people talk.
But that problem is not solely in technology and AI. Like as humans, we have an information problem of mass content generation right now, and it's up to us to decipher what is accurate. I mean, you go back to the earliest days of social studies in 5th and 6th grade where you learn about primary and secondary and tertiary sources.
Yep.
And then you just throw that out the window right now. And that I know that I'm personally guilty of that. I've perpetuated things that I believe to be true that maybe aren't or are. And like, that is not just technology telling you the wrong thing. It's also humans perpetuating that issue.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because like you could also say though, back before, pre-internet, it's like your mom was the source of truth.
Yeah, she still is.
Anyway, yeah, shout out to mom. Yeah, no, I mean, so yeah, that's an interesting problem in and of itself, is like, what is truth?
Yeah,
and how do you get real signal through the noise? For both, I mean, we're in election season too. Like that's a whole other thing.
Right.
Is like, I actually think it's interesting if you watch kind of culturally, like we're making this transition from everybody believing everything that they saw to nobody believing anything that they see. And I think that's actually probably a healthier, I guess maybe the way I'd put it is, it starts you at a location where you can actually learn whether or not your hypothesis is correct or not. If your default assumption is that the hypothesis is correct, then like there's actually no correction step in that. And so that's really dangerous, I think, culturally. What's interesting though, is like we're transitioning to like nobody believing anything, which hopefully we get into like a primary, secondary, tertiary source type mentality again, because of the fact that now everybody knows that AI can create things that, that look real and aren't necessarily.
So you being my AI sounding board now, like
perfect.
We keep talking about the word belief. And I mean, that's a very core thing to who we are as humans. It affects how we operate, what we do, what we believe is based upon, again, those beliefs. Like, what if beliefs are cutting away like dead wood, and it's what remains is the belief, and the things should be built upon that, rather than it's just like taking in everything and it's like, well, I believe this because I heard this there. And rather it's like, it's what is inaccurate about this, and getting down to like first principles of like what remains there, and then trying to build back out from that point.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like beliefs are like the composition of raw data into ideas, right? It's like I have all these inputs from people around me, and I'm going to interpret those inputs into like a set of values or a set of like a grouping, and then that's what I believe to be true. I think that's like we don't think about like what leads to the things that we believe. And I think if you break it down even further, you're talking about first principles. I think the interaction between things in your environment is the most fundamental data input that you have. So I know that if I knock this glass off the table, it's going to fall and break on the ground. How did I know that? Well, I know that I've seen glass hit the ground before. I know what glass is. Like I know what's in the cup, which is water. I know that this table's high enough. Like there's a lot of embedded assumptions that based on prior context that is built out. We're building models literally in our brain based on the inputs and outputs that we've experienced in the environment. And so that's what I think beliefs are, is just a combination of the inputs and outputs and the intelligence over the top of that gives us a framework from which we can operate. And so like the reason why people like there's a lot of value in beliefs is because that's the core set, that's the baseline on which you operate. So like if I tell you to go and rob a bank, you're gonna be like, I don't, there's something that I believe that precludes me from being in the group of people that would go and rob a bank. Like there's a lot of value in that, but you kind of get into like this nihilistic approach where it's like, it's neither good nor bad, right? It's just a belief and a norm.
So then going on your point of the world, your world is built upon models, and that is what allows you to operate. Then I would say that worry, anxiety, and stress is instability in the model. It is something that you've thought to be true, or it's a version of the world in which you thought you were operating, and you come to find out that you're actually operating in a different.
I actually don't think that it's in the model. I think it's in the input. It's instability in the input that goes into the model, right? So like you have a baseline of things that are getting input into the model, and me feeling good or bad changes those inputs, slightly, which also impacts how my model interprets or breaks down, the things that I'm experiencing. And so I think that's where, like, we were talking about the highs and lows and stuff, is it's like, interpretation is a lot of like what our experience is.
Yeah. So are you saying interpretation is an element of the model, or are you saying interpretation is the input?
I think you have what reality is, whatever we want to call that. You have the interpretation of that and then applied to the model. So like, trying to think of a good example. I mean, we call these mental models, right? People use them all the time. The reason that we do that is it's a shortcut to an end state.
Right.
It's like, if this happens, I run it through these set of rules that I have set for myself, and I can manage the output. I don't have to critically think about this, every time. And so I think, like, if your mental model is like not robbing a bank, right? But you can pre-filter that on like, am I feeling really angry and like I need money really bad? like there's an input that would change the mental model where you might actually shift that point of view because you like how you're feeling that day, or the noise in the signal, overrides the actual mental model that you have.
How often do you need to, this goes back to the very early conversation, how often do you need to evaluate and adjust your mental models?
I think all the time. And I also think that like there's, core belief is like a hard thing, too, because there's, when a core belief changes, it shakes you to the core. Right. And so I think that's a thing that we should be very considerate of, is like, what are the core beliefs that we have? Because that's the foundation for which everything else is built on. I struggle a little bit too, with this mentality that we have today, that like, I'm beholden to my own opinions, right? So I say something, and then in 18 months when we do our next podcast, I disagree with that. And somebody says, well, you clearly disagree with yourself. It's like, that's called growth.
Yeah.
So
mental model change.
Yeah. The thing that I like to say is like, I have strong opinions held loosely, right? Like I feel pretty confident about the things that I think I'm confident about, but I'm not so confident that I can't take that input and go, maybe this changes something for me. And I think that's incredibly important, and not like I'm always subject to, like, I reserve the right to change my opinion
100%.
And I don't think enough people think about the fact that it's like, you should change your opinion. Because if not, like, dude, my opinion on skinny jeans was way different in the 6th grade, like I'm glad I changed that perspective. And
wait, were you pro or against in 6th grade?
I was pro.
Oh God.
Yeah, it was terrible. But I think my 6th grade was different than your 6th grade too. So, yeah. But the point being, like, everybody has a perspective. There's things that they hold near and dear to, like, who they are, right? Skater is like something that was near and dear to me in middle school, but like, I'm clearly not a skater, now. And so how do you figure out like what is core and what is, superfluous, if you will, like, doesn't matter to your actual who you are.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing about that is, you talked earlier about with the mental models and interpretation of the input, from a neurological standpoint, like, having things in your life that you dislike, whether that is discipline, or it's going to work out, or it's doing things at work, or whatever, like, is hard in your life, from a neurological standpoint, I don't remember the actual terminology, but if you build a habit of doing hard things, it actually becomes easier. I believe it's an area in the hippocampus in the front of the brain, that over time you actually start to enjoy the process. And then I believe it preserves cognition as you get older. So like, your brain functions better. Like, there's actually some sort of positive outcome tied to forcing yourself to do difficult things on a consistent basis.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's, not to take a slight tangent, but my dad used to say, if you're harder on yourself than the world is, then life gets real easy. And that sounds
just like your dad.
Yeah, I know. Right? Well, he lives right over here.
Yeah.
With me. Like, I I think that there's something to be said for that. It's like if you intentionally induce difficulty or challenge, that's significantly harder than like what the world induces for you on a regular basis, and it's like you're playing life on easy mode because you're the OP character that's like all built up and stuff because you've experienced all these very difficult things, and then now it's just like now you got to live.
Yeah.
Right.
What is you're a very high performing individual. I'm curious, how do you treat yourself? Like, how do you balance between being the dictator that needs you to do more and consistently perform versus allowing yourself grace and time to rest, relax, recover?
Yeah, I don't really like the concept that like relaxation is sitting on the couch eating potato chips type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like I prefer to think about relaxation as like a break from the things that you don't love to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be like that it's easy, from like either a mental or physical capacity perspective. I think it's just that you enjoy spending your time in that way. And so I think a lesson that I've learned over time is, I can either choose to watch Netflix and eat potato chips and, which is something I would, objectively enjoy.
Yeah.
Or I can also spend time reading about AI and looking at technology and, all of the different things that I find passionate in. And so it's like, hey, like if those two are on an equal playing field, or even if, I enjoy Netflix and potato chips a little bit more, like how do I, that differential and like things to do is very little. And so it's easier for me, even if it's like, it takes a little bit of effort, like it's easier for me to make the decision between those two things. And like, all right, Dane, you need to go for a 10-mile run and eating potato chips and sitting on the couch. That's a high differential, status. And so for me, it's like, hey, let's find productive things that are at least, or, similarly comparable, if you will, to, the things that aren't productive, and just focus on those productive things.
Yeah. If it was like 10 tiers and 10 tiers go run 100 miles and tier 1 is let's go watch Netflix, you're saying let's choose between 1, 2, or 3 rather than 1 or 10.
Yeah. And despite like, let's say, running 100 miles and like, reading a dissertation on AI, like not that it's hard, they're apples and oranges to weigh, but they're both difficult things objectively. But I would much rather read the dissertation than run the 100 miles. Right. And so I think if you orient yourself in a way that the hard things that you're supposed to be doing are actually easy because you have interest in them, you can make a lot of progress really fast.
Where does your call to be better from? Like, why don't you just go on the couch and watch Netflix and eat chips? Like, why do you even have that voice in your head that says, let's choose something that is just a hair better than that?
That's a good question. I think part of it is like, I have like maybe this, here's the vulnerability for you. It's like, I have this fear that like, what is it for? What's everything for? Right. And I guess like maybe a conclusion I came to is that if there's not truly a reason for there to be something, then like a good reason is to do better, like the whole meaning of life thing. It's like, if first principles, like if the worst case scenario, imagine the worst case scenario is that there is no meaning, right? Like, not to get dark, like I don't actually believe this, but like imagine the worst case scenario is that there is no meaning to life. It's like, well, then what's the meaning I can assign to something to actually make it worth it? And so I think that's kind of the answer, like at a existential, perspective, is it's just like, it's all that I know to do to improve things for me and the people that I care about. I think is kind of fundamentally what it is.
Yeah. It's like, how do you change the world? Well, one person can't change the world, but you can change it one person at a time.
Yeah.
And so it's like doing the next right thing can have a compounding impact down the road.
Yeah. And to your point, it's like, changing the world requires a lot of effort from a lot of people. And so, my thought process is like, if I can make things a little bit better, then at least I'm contributing, to that forward motion. But there, I guess that's a long story short, to your question, like, I don't know. But that would be my speculation, is that it's this like desire to assign value or meaning to something.
Do you think that desire is innate, or do you think that was learned?
I think everybody it's a little bit innate. Otherwise, humans wouldn't make progress like they have, right? So I think there's a propensity in people to push forward and to try new things and to experiment. I think that there's also an element of like what you're rewarded for, growing up, right? So like I grew up in a household where I was very fortunate, and I felt like I always got positive reinforcement for doing good things, whether that was, sports or, doing well on tests or whatever it was. And I think for a lot of folks, like they maybe didn't have that reinforcement. And so I think there's a learned aspect of this too, which is like, we should be cheering for the people that need cheered for. Unfortunately, most of the time, the people who are cheered for don't need the cheering, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That is, I think to start with the innate part, my thoughts there are from an evolutionary standpoint, like the purpose of humanity was to continue the progression of the species. And once you're able to secure that you have enough food, you are able to procreate and reproduce, and your offspring are able to survive in order to continue that cycle. That need was met. So then why continue to live the world in a positive standpoint? I'm a religious person, and I think, in my opinion, that it almost seems that religion came into play with the idea of like, you are called to more and there's something bigger than yourself. And so you are called to spend your life aiming in an upward direction. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's just like the stark contrast of purely evolutionary standpoint, or there's something greater. And that's the differentiation in my head for that innate argument.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I've grown up religious. I would consider myself to be a religious person too. When I get into these conversations, I would try and separate that from the conversation overall, because that's a framework that I choose to partake in that, and this is going to probably be a little bit controversial, but, like, nobody really knows.
Right.
Right. And like, that's the whole point of faith, is that you have faith. Nobody really knows. And, we have books and whatever, like, but in reality, it's like, you weren't there, So I think that there's like a level of like, I think it's good to think about it as a framework, but I try and separate myself from that when I think through like, what are the innate reasons why people make decisions that they make? Because I think, in a lot of ways, like religions are a result of, to your point, like that, push forward and wanting to pass down lessons to people and to share, learnings and, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, but I also think that the ones that won out are the ones that have been, talked about most, or, like you rarely, it'd be interesting. Like, these are examples of things I like lay in bed and think about at night. It's like, it'd be interesting to think about the number of like religions that lived and died over the course of humanity, right? Like, because those are all concepts and ideas, and like to some degree or another, those ideas won out versus, their counterparts. And so it's just interesting to think, and like democracy is another great example of this. It's like, how the hell did we end up here? Like, this is not, democracy is not an intuitive thing. If you look at humanity as a whole, like, suddenly we have like this superpower, and by the way, we're going to like democratize the power, literally democratize the power to everybody who's a citizen. Like, if we look at like history, what happens is one person seizes power and they take it all for themselves. Right. So like, I have this really kind of strong interest in these core ideals that happen that seem counterintuitive to like what we see or what the human condition is.
Do you think that, so it's interesting that you talk about like one person seizing power, because that follows the Pareto distribution very well, where 20% of the inputs account for 80% of the outputs. Mm-hmm. And so that'd be like one person holding all of the wealth or the majority of the power in one situation. Do you think that democracy is heading in that type of direction?
Yeah. Well, it's tough because you see that distribution even within democracy, right? Like, there's still a significant wealth distribution difference between the top 5% in the United States versus like the bottom 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, like, not to get into politics, everybody's tired of politics right now anyway, but like, I think that we have to be cognizant of the systems that we decide to live our lives in. So democracy is an example of like, hey, in the purest sense, like everybody should be able to vote and to have a say, and your voice matters and all of those different things. When we get into systems where the rules are misaligned and you end up with these Paretos that show up, you have to start to ask, like, what are the things that are happening within that system that lead to that? And so I think there's, again, that applies to a lot of broad things too. So this is my attempt at like ducking the political, part of it.
Yeah, I was about to dive out of that anyway, so you're fine.
But I think from a systems perspective, like the things that drive behavior are they're the rules that are set.
Yeah.
Right? And so fundamentally, how do we set the right rules to make sure that we're successful?
And I'm going to leave that as a mental exercise that you're given to the audience, because I am so far out of my element whenever we go down that route. But what I want to tangent that conversation, still following the same line of the Pareto distribution. Have you ever considered that in your own life?
Oh, dude, I use that concept a lot. It's actually a really hard reflective process to do by yourself, because that's actually, well, I mean, I talked to you about like the ChatGPT being my sounding board.
Right.
Like, I think that's the value of having like close friends or, a significant other or whoever that can give you direct feedback on things, is because like it's hard for anybody, unless it's very intentional, to take a step back and go, man, what I've been working on really hard isn't really very, very valuable. Right. Like that's not an intuitive thing for people to say. So I actually think it's really hard to apply the Pareto principle in your personal life.
But you still try.
I do my best. Yeah. Well, and conceptually, like, again, it's a filter that you can run things through. So like, there's a lot of, so example, we have people who like come to the house and clean. Now, I kind of feel bad about that, to be honest. But what I did is I realized that like, hey, most of the time that we're spending not hanging out together, me and my wife, is spent, cleaning and picking up the house. And it's like, we can solve this problem pretty simply.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think there's a lot of things like that in life where if you just kind of take a step back and go like, hey, do you like doing this? No. Do you like doing this? No, I really hate doing this. It's like, okay, well, let's actually figure out a plan for how we address that problem. Most people just do stuff.
Yeah.
They don't actually think about like, do I enjoy doing this? Is this what I need to spend my time doing? And, it's sad because I also feel like of late I've become increasingly aware of like my own time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that people pay enough attention to like the opportunity cost of time.
And like, to go one step deeper on that, like in what context have you become increasingly aware of your time?
Well, like I said, like yard work, like house stuff, all that. I also think I could read a book as opposed to weed eat.
Yeah.
Right. So like,
you really hate that lawn work.
Yeah. Well, actually, so in some cases I do enjoy it, but I think it's like that kind of stuff where it's like, even reflecting on things that I do for work, it's like, hey, we need to write this document. And it's like, okay, I could spend a bunch of time formatting things for this document, but if I hand this off to somebody, do they understand kind of the gist of what we're trying to go for?
Right. Is it good enough?
There's an incremental amount of effort I can put into making that good, like really good, or able to be communicated. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think thinking through things in that framework of like, am I trying to make a really pretty marketing tool that we're going to like actually publish, and the value of it is how good it looks or how concise it is? Or is this that I need to, tell my teammate that I need them to do X, Y, and Z? And if it's that case, then I probably shouldn't spend the time, to do it.
That's really interesting, because I wonder, that makes me think of, I wrote a lot of papers in high school.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me think of the rough draft, because I almost feel like you could apply the Pareto principle to that, where the rough draft is 20% of the time, but 80% of the output. But then you spend 80% of the time editing that last 20%.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I'm a big fan of like, I don't know, maybe I live my life by rough drafts. I don't know, but I'm a big fan of like getting things on paper or getting the first iteration done and then reevaluating, right? So like imagine that you like wrote a rough draft and the question was like, or imagine that somebody wrote a rough draft and the question is this good enough or not? It's like, well, you have to read it, right? Like you can't just like assume, that this is going to be good or not. And it's like the likelihood is that it could either be this needs revisions or this is good enough to go. So like, I think there's a level of using like the rough draft framework of like, just get the minimum viable thing out the door and get people to view it. That'll tell you like, is this good enough or not?
I would also be hypocritical to say, to not admit though, that I am in some areas rather OCD and very detailed in that last 20%.
Really?
Like, especially with the restaurant, it's like, you talk about guest experience and you talk about providing an experience for someone coming in here. And it's the details that matter in that instance, where it's like 80% good doesn't differentiate you from the competition. It's that last 20% in the restaurant specifically that's going to make the difference for the customer.
Yeah. So I think that's right. But I think it's a misstep to say that it's not valuable, right? Because I guess what I would say is like your scale shifts at that point, right? Because so like Chick-fil-A is a great example of this. And everybody probably knows what I'm talking about, right? You walk into Chick-fil-A, you feel like you're special.
Yeah.
Right? Like they treat you very, very well. And it is an incremental, maybe 20%, of effort, for that. But I think you get an outsized return, which is why Chick-fil-A is so successful in the market. And so I wouldn't say that it's like, the 20% in value. I think what you've done is you've shifted the median, kind of up, or I guess down, right? So it's like a lot of the value that you guys generate comes from customer service, whereas like somebody else in the industry, a lot of the value comes from the food that's created or whatever. I mean, obviously you guys have great food too. So
what are you saying here, Dane?
Yeah, I said that and I was like, oh no, I got a backstep.
He's like, I'm compensating.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you just have to understand what the customer wants, right? So like my new roles in product, a lot of times people don't understand what they actually need when they ask for features and stuff.
Right.
And so it gets down to like, what's the crux of what people are looking for when they're actually, going to consume whatever it is that you have.
What is it like being in a startup now? Because you go from Coke Industries that's been around for so long and is the second largest privately held company in the world to a startup.
It's awesome in so many ways. Like you have the ability to really impact roadmap, how fast things are moving, for better or for worse. So there's a little bit of like embedded stress, in that as well, because if I make a mistake and it makes it to production, like that really impacts us.
It's got your name on it.
Yeah. So there's a level of like criticality that comes along with that, but I absolutely love it. I will say it's interesting too, like we talked about mental models, Coke has some very, very strong mental models, and mental models kind of roll up into like a culture, right? So, they talk about like a company has a really good culture. It's like people have shared mental models for how the world works and how it should work. At a startup, we have a strong culture. The people are great, all that stuff, but we just don't have all the systems that have kind of, the systems reflect the mental models over time, and we just don't have the systems built. And so that's part of the fun as well, is like we get to build those systems, but we have to be careful to make sure that we're building them in an appropriate way, so that they stand the test of time, into the future.
Yeah, you have to be very intentional about it.
Yeah. So it's, and, in a startup too, like you have this propensity to go move fast, right? It's what everybody move fast and break things, right? And I think that's really an incredibly important part of running or working in a startup. But I also think that there's like an aspect of like, you have to pull your head up and get some air every once in a while and go like, hey, are we moving directionally in the right direction?
Right.
Because, people say like, oh, just put one step in front of the other. But if you like pull your head up and you're in the wrong spot, like all those steps before, led to an outcome that you didn't want.
Yeah. It's kind of like working in the business versus working on the business. Both of them are entirely necessary, but they're both different perspectives on where you're heading and what's going on.
I'm a big fan too of like put a stake in the ground for what you think the future looks like, and then work backwards to get there. Because I think otherwise, actually, let me take this back. I'm a big fan of being micro ambitious too. That's what I call it. It's like if you don't know what you like want to do, and like you're just kind of trying to find purpose and meaning, it's like get micro ambitious about things and just execute on whatever you find interest in that's right in front of you. Mm-hmm. So like start a restaurant, like go and execute on the things that are most obvious to you right in front of you in order to find kind of the thing that you want to do. So like, I think for a lot of college students, that's a really valuable thing, is it's like, hey, don't waffle around on like, do I want to be this or that? It's like, just go do a class in that.
Right.
And then you'll know if you want to do more of that. Right. So I think that's really helpful when you're in this like discovery mode. But I think when you're in like a mode of like, okay, we kind of know what we need to execute on, it's really valuable to go like, what is the pinnacle of execution in this realm that I'm in? And then work backwards to a point to where it's like, okay, we can build incrementally and we can move fast in these directions, but I have a North Star. That way, if we start building and we diverge a little bit, we can pop our heads up and go, oh, we're misaligned. Let's course correct.
I really, really like that. Both things you said, because I remember when I was younger and I was like, man, what kind of business should I start? Like, I just knew I wanted to do something kind of along those lines, but I hadn't done anything, so I didn't know anything.
Yep.
And then now it's like that we're so far into this process, and then John and I have had other small businesses in college. I have like 100 things I want to do right now. But now it's to the second part you're saying, I've got that first North Star. And actually today I actually was building out a pro forma, working it backwards from that North Star to where we are now and what that roadmap could look like. I struggle with knowing it's not going to go to plan, but still getting myself to build it, because I think it's important to do that. Otherwise, you're subject to ambiguity and going off course.
Man, that is such a great point too. Like, the plan, this is the hard part about planning, is a lot of times when people want to do like a 3-year plan or whatever, like they want to be right.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty, it's like the inverse. It's like you want to be like, you go into it knowing you're going to be wrong.
Right.
But it's like, what's the best prediction that I can make today, that can drive that? And I think that's the thing that you go back and you revisit, periodically, is like, what were the core assumptions that I had? Were they validated or not? Do I need to change the core assumptions based on something that's changed? But don't get tied to a long-term plan, because it always is wrong.
Yeah.
I've never seen a plan longer than like maybe 6 months that's 100% accurate.
My biggest learning lesson to myself has been, add in a contingency line item.
Yep.
You're going to go over budget. It's going to take longer. You're going to end up on a different road than you anticipated. Like, know the general direction, but add in some, like even today, I purposely put a couple numbers lower than what I think they would be, because I just know things are going to go wrong at some point.
Well, and I think there's like a level of wisdom. You have to like have done this enough times and then had it not work out for you to go like, oh, okay, I really should build this in. Because like if you tell somebody, it's funny, it's like buying a house, right? Like when I bought a house, everybody says like, if you're going to do a renovation, plan to like spend 20% more than what
Always
you
20.
expect, all these different things, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, sure. Like I'm smarter than that, right? And then on the dot, it's like 19.5%. I'm like, well, shit. Like maybe if I would have just paid attention to what these people. So I think like, I think that there's a level of like, you have to make the mistake. There's that quote, I can't remember what it is. It's like, people can only meet you to the degree that they meet themselves, right? It's like, you have to go and do it. You have to make the mistakes,
right,
in some cases. And the best case scenario is that you learn, the lessons that course correct you as you make those.
With the restaurant, I've never owned a home, so I can't comment on that. But with the restaurant, everyone was saying that it was going to take like 11 months to develop, ended up taking 14 or 15.
Yep.
And then in the construction world, because we built this out from just like a blank shell, it was literally just like the structural layout, nothing else inside of it. And that's called change orders. Whenever something doesn't go to plan, you have a change order, and that's your contingency. And I was like, what do you mean change orders? We're just going to do it right the first time. Like, what are we talking about? No, we had tens of thousands of dollars in change orders.
Yeah, it's but I mean, it's a good lesson too. Well, so this goes back to what we were saying earlier, though. Like, if you're harder on yourself than the world, then at some point, imagine if you guys would have planned on 18 months and then you woke up at 14, you're like, oh, this is great.
I would always rather be far more aggressive than anyone else's expectation, because I very rarely think I will hit the actual goal I set, but I'd rather set such an ambitious goal so high, but like I miss and I still end up higher than where I would have if I would have hit someone else's lower goal.
I think that's a good way to live life, but I also think, to your point earlier, like you can't be hard on yourself. You have to be realistic about like, hey, we knew when we set this goal that it was ambitious.
Yeah.
And if you don't achieve it, you can't be like, oh, I suck.
That has been the current like 3-year cycle I've been on, is like being less of a dictator with myself. And I've gotten a little bit better at it, like giving myself more grace, but dear God, I was a dictator for a while.
Well, the way I think about it is like, how you like, I try and manage myself the same way I'd want to be managed or to manage a team.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, give yourself a little grace, like understand that, people make mistakes. Like you want them to be ambitious, but if they don't achieve the most ambitious goal, you're not going to hold them accountable. Like I try and apply that same framework to myself too. And so that's something you can consider, which by the way, you now have a team. How is trying to manage, I guess you're very ambitious. You have a lot that you want to, execute in your life. How do you, make sure that doesn't bleed over dramatically into team?
It's learning. I mean, I'm definitely not great at it. We're 3 weeks into being open now.
So you're an expert.
No, not at all. I will say it's weird having, so we have a general manager and a kitchen manager. They're both great. They're both double John and Mai's age.
Yep.
And so we are managing people that are older than us and have more experience than us. But at the same time, like you're talking about, like we have very high standards. And so it's like, how much should I be going and doing myself for other people because they don't see things the way that I see them, meaning like the little details of how things are on the table or noticing the spot where it's not clean or X, Y, and Z. Like how much of that should John and I be doing, knowing that we have ambition to scale this beyond ourselves? And then that leaves a gap if we leave this first location, go and open a second and go and do other things outside of that, versus pointing it out in a way where it's not overloading people, where it's not being a total pain in the ass, but also still getting people to notice and understand how important these things are.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too. So like here's a question. How do you know that what you think is important is actually important? What metrics are you using to determine if the thing that you think is important is actually important?
I mean, it's a really, really case by case basis. Like for example, there should never be any instance where someone walks up to a table here and there's any spot of syrup or ketchup or anything on the table. Like I don't care how small it is, you can feel it if it's sticky. When you set the menu down, you can just tell it goes a certain way.
Right.
And customers notice that. And when John and I went to Florida for 4 months and worked in the restaurants there before we opened this one, we noticed when customers were picking up on that, and it instantly sets off the guest experience in a negative way. And I like that first impression is everything, and we got to nail that.
Yep.
And so that's how I know for that instance, but other areas I could definitely add more metrics to.
Well, and I'm not I'm not forcing you to excavate all of these on the podcast type of thing, but the reason I'm asking that is because I think there's a lot of like things that we think are intuitive as to why we do things.
Yeah.
But also like we should challenge our own norms of like, this is a me thing. Is this a me thing, or is this like a everybody type of thing too?
Yeah, that's hard.
It is tough, but I think that's kind of the sign of a good leader too, though, is it's like, hey, so I'm trying to think of an example that's, like imagine that you had like a super stringent like napkin folding regimen or something like that. It's like, okay, I've never been to a restaurant and like the folding of the napkins was like, oh, this is off, like I'm never coming back here type of thing. So I don't know. Like, I guess what I'm saying is like, I think the hard part about being a leader is trusting other people to make decisions, and then also realizing where like your preconceived notions may be different.
And I think that's really good for me having John, because he really helps me balance that, because I just know that I have different standards, different ways of doing things than some people do. And oftentimes, I will spend too much time in that last 20% whenever I don't need to.
Yep.
And he's pretty good at being like, hey, it's not worth it, man. You don't need to do that.
And the way that you scale what you're talking about is by not spending the time on the additional 20%, right? Because if you think, Jacob's like, since when did I join the podcast?
I'm about to lose it, man.
Yeah, no, but I mean, like, I think that's true. Like, if you think about 20% spent here, or, let's say, well, it's 20% of the time for 80% of the reward.
Yeah.
Is the distribution. I mean, you could spend, an incremental 20%. So you're spending 40% here and you're getting to 85, or you could spend 40% and get to 160%.
To challenge you though, culture starts with the founders in the early stage of the organization. Like, for example, First Form, I mentioned earlier, has this incredible culture. One of the things that they do that they started with their founder that I've had in the podcast, when someone received an order of supplements, they got a handwritten note from the founder.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't scale. He can't be doing that for the millions of orders that they're doing monthly now.
Mm-hmm.
But that culture started with him. The employees saw it as a standard he expected. And that still happens with shipments that come out by their employees.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I'm balancing is like, what do I need to be doing and ingraining in the culture in these early days and setting that standard? And then you're right. What do I not need to be doing as well?
Yeah. I agree. I mean, the goal of culture is that people can make decisions like you would without you being there. Right. Like that's the intention of creating the culture. And so I again, like I don't know the business, like I'm right. Just, I'm poking a little bit or prodding.
No, it's very healthy. I appreciate it.
Because I do think that like, I think it's shared values too of like, hey, this is important. The reason we're here is because we want to provide a good experience for everybody. Like it's the things that undermine all of those other decisions that you're talking about that are important from a culture perspective. And I think the execution of those happens as a result of a strong enough alignment.
I agree with you. I appreciate you challenging me. Yeah, I'm going to be laying in bed thinking about this tonight.
Well, and I've never worked in the restaurant business, and I like my experience with your team has been phenomenal, right? Walk in, the customer experience has been great. So, this is not a super opinionated because of that, but I do think it's important, especially as your team expands. There's just a lot of things that, you have to challenge yourself on too.
Well, what else have you learned about being a leader? Because I mean, you were young leading a team at Coke, and I mean, I feel like you've probably grown a lot through that.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is like, I've had people on my team that are significantly, my senior. I've had people on my team that are much younger, than I am. I find that as people get older, age actually doesn't matter a whole lot. So like to the younger guys, it's like, or gals, it's like they're my senior. And so it makes sense that they're my boss. I think when it comes to being like somebody's actual manager, the respect comes from knowing that you're competent. Mm-hmm. Right. And so you don't have to be competent in everything. And like, I think that's something that's really important. And that's where you lean on other people that are super competent in those things. But I think it's like a fundamental, like, I believe that you have a vision or a purpose that I can get aligned with.
Yeah.
And I think where that's the difference between a leader and a manager is setting that vision and having people bought into it. It's not that you're better at at every job.
Do you feel like you're starting to establish that at Squint, or do you feel like that's going to take a while?
It'll take a while, not for a couple of reasons. One, like we have a super capable team, right? So it's like, I'm probably the least capable of the people on the team from like a technical perspective, from like a knowledge perspective, just because I don't have any of the context of what's happened, before. So I don't think that you can shortcut. I mean, somebody can be given a manager title. You can't really be given a leader title.
Yeah.
Right. Like people have to believe in you in order to lead the team. And so I think right now I'm kind of doing the legwork to show people that I'm worth following, if that makes sense.
You're earning it.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
So because again, like, and you can, you can manage people. Right. You can tell them what time they should be here, what their responsibilities are, all those different things. But until they feel kind of inspired and safe and aligned, with me, like you're not leading them. Right. So I feel like I'm in a managing my tasks and learning to learning the ropes enough to deserve the lead role.
I really like that distinction of you can tell them what to do, when to be there, and how to do it versus them feeling inspired to do those things.
Yeah. I think getting like putting a compelling enough kind of point of view in front of, or a vision, in front of people that they're excited about it and there's a reason for them to do the thing that you're trying to get them to do. That's like you're 70% there if you can do that.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because I think a lot of times people get into these roles and they think like, oh, leadership is me telling people what to do. And it's like, no, leadership is setting the right guidelines and vision for people to execute and tell you what they need to do. And that's a very different thing.
It's like you're empowering them kind of.
Yeah, exactly. It's all empowerment because nobody ever got anywhere, bossing people around, or they did, but they got their, they got a short trip.
Yeah, it didn't last.
Yeah. So it's unsustainable.
Yeah, that is the case in point for dictatorship and Hitler.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, in democracy.
Yeah.
So back to the conversation. But
okay, as we start to wrap up, we're about 90 minutes in. I have a question from Grant, and I think we've kind of already hit on it. I love going to Grant for these. Okay. He said, I would be interested to see how Dane balances everything he's doing in a way that is sustainable long-term, and if it is necessary to go through tough times that are not sustainable in order to achieve lofty goals.
Yeah, I love this question. And it's funny hearing this from Grant, given that we used to work together and be on the same team. I'm not a really big fan of this whole concept of like work-life balance. We hit on it a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But I think it's like work-life integration is a much more effective way to think about what work looks like in the 21st century. And so, for me, it's like making sure that flexibility of, getting things that I need to done, but like, I don't mind if I have to, finish a paper or something, or like a white paper or something, late at night because I have the flexibility during the day to get things done. So I actually don't think that like separation of work from personal life is really like an effective way to be able to have high output. So yeah, that would be my first one, is like figure out work-life integration and what works best for you. And then I think what was the second part of his question?
I believe it's something along the lines of, are the tough times necessary to go through to achieve lofty goals?
For sure. I think also, to take this back to the leadership perspective too, is there's a lot of people who like, Elon's notorious for this, right? He just expects you to grind always.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's sustainable, actually. I think that in a case where you've built a brand like SpaceX, you can churn through people and they're all very talented people, then you can force people to grind on a consistent basis. But if you want to actually build like, a sustainable team, I think being clear with people of like, hey, when it's time to get this done, like we're all going to grind and we're going to do this together.
Yeah.
And it's going to suck for a little bit, but that's okay, because once we're done with that, like we can all take a break and, we're all friends, like we're all going to get through this together type of thing. I think that's a much more effective strategy for managing both kind of life and also, people. Because the reality of life is that there's so many unpredictable things. And I think teams that kind of stay together and trust each other work much more effectively than ones that are just constantly, on the rat or like the hamster wheel.
Well, and you talk about building culture and building that A team, and I'm literally picturing the highs and lows, frequency waves, as we talked about at the very beginning of this. Like the tough times is a natural selection process where you're right, it's not sustainable, but that's why it's in the wave form. When you're at that low period and the people can't sustain that, it will naturally weed them out. And then you are left with what is stronger of a team. And then you guys can celebrate and relax, recover, and then go through the trials and tribulations again together.
Well, think about like any team that you've been a part of. Like think about what you remember from the times you spent with that team. It's like, man, we really worked hard on, or we busted our ass to get this thing done. Or, we played this really difficult team in some kind of sport, or like it's never like oh hey it was an average practice on an average day. Nobody remembers those days. Like you remember the outliers when you really figured it out. And I think that's a key thing in life is like, I used to tell the team at Coke, like someday we'll look back on these days and they'll be the good old days, right? It's like, what are the things that you remember? And I think it's almost always where you had a struggle that you overcame with people and with the team. And so I think having the struggle is a necessary part, but I think it's also the reflection on that's important for kind of instilling the longer term benefits of having gone through that.
I've got two thoughts to that. The first one being, that's why I love ultra marathons. They're addictive because they suck, but like it's so memorable because of that level of suck. And whenever you actually cross the finish line and you've achieved that goal you set out for through that period of suck, it's the highest high.
Yeah.
And the fact that I haven't achieved that the last 2 races that I've done makes it memorable, but also makes me want it that much more this time around. And I feel like the same thing as whenever you're going through it with your team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's, I the things that we remember are the things that are unique. And so like the way to have a longer life is to remember more, which is to do more unique things.
I like that.
And so, I think that's a key is like, it's much harder to make things immediately really good than it is to do hard things.
Right.
Right. And so like the kind of lower barrier to entry thing to do is like, get out there and run, which is pretty low barrier to do, but it sucks, right? Like there's a lot more things that make life kind of memorable that are hard than are easy.
Yeah. The second thought that I had there was you commented on telling your team these are the good old days. And I think identifying that takes a level of self-awareness, and it's very difficult. And there's this song by Macklemore called Good Old Days that came out when I was in high school. I was a sophomore. Mm-hmm. I just got my first car, just got my driver's license. And I was driving through the neighborhood in the fall listening to that song. And literally like that was like the first time I realized this is the good old days right now. And I still, whenever I go home and I drive through that section, I go back to that memory of the good old days.
Well, I think for you guys, like, I mean, you're in this inflection point right now too, where it's like you have a founding team, that's with you. Like guys, we're starting this together. This is crazy.
Yeah.
Like make sure you take a step back and recognize how unique this time in life is, because, not everybody experiences. Yeah. How old are you?
23.
Being 23, opening, a restaurant, like doing all the things like running ultra marathon, like not like there's a very small percentage of people who are experiencing that in life. And I think it's important to step back and go, wow, like these are the good old days. Like I'm not going to be able to run 100-mile marathons my whole life.
I really like the idea of building your life resume, like not just professionally, but also things outside of it, whether that's skydiving, whether that's taking an ice bath, whether that's a ultra marathon, like all of these experiences. Like when you die, you're not taking anything with you. Like that's so cliche to say, but all you're going to have are those memories that you made. And so you have to live in all those areas at once.
Yeah. Well, and I know you're trying to wrap this up, so I'll try and keep this brief, but I mean, that's one of the things that led me to make the decision to leave Coke and go join a startup is my wife, I don't even know if she would remember saying this, so it's kind of funny, but so she's watching TV, she's like really into the show. I'm trying to talk to her about, this potential job move that I'm going to make. And she just kind of said, well, what would you do if you weren't scared?
Oh, dude.
In passing. And I'm like, that's probably one of the more profound things you've ever said to me.
She just dropped the wisdom while watching Law and Order.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that made me think a lot. And then there's a level of like, if I was going to write a story, what would the chapter be that I'd be really interested in reading? And this is it, right? For better or for worse, like, this will be much more interesting than continuing to do what I was doing before.
What would you title this chapter?
This chapter, man, I think this will be a chapter of transitions. So, and I wish I had a more profound. I need ChatGPT right now, my thought partner.
Yeah.
But maybe it's Dichotomy is the name of the
Okay.
chapter, because life is so significantly different over the course of only a few weeks, like almost completely flipped on its head, which is a fascinating place to be.
As a consequence of one decision.
As a consequence of one decision.
That's a good thought process for everyone listening. Is like, what one decision could you make that would flip everything on its head?
Yeah. And it's a scary chapter for me too, because it's like, I went into this knowing that it was going to change everything. Right. But I think that's the indicator for why to do it too, is that I knew it was going to be scary.
Growth, man. All right, Dane, where can people find you online if they want to connect, reach out, learn more?
Yeah. LinkedIn, Dane Laughlin is my name. And yeah, I mean, you can find me on social media and stuff too, but LinkedIn is probably the best place to connect.
Awesome. I'm at Jacob O'Connor. The podcast is Real Period Conversations. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend. Dane, my final question for you. Looking back at this really fun journey you're on, what advice would you offer to your 23-year-old self?
Manage yourself like you'd manage other people. And maybe that's poor advice, given that some 23-year-olds may not have had many jobs. But if you've had managers that you didn't like, make sure that you don't treat yourself the same way that manager treated you.
I love it. Thanks for coming on, man.
Yep. Thanks.